Should you cook your brisket fat cap up or fat cap down inside of your Kamado? Today, we are answering the debate because I picked up two identical briskets and I'm going to prepare one each way to find out which is best. Hey, I'm James from Smoking Dad Barbecue, and I've been grilling and smoking longer than Facebook has even been a company. But that doesn't mean there weren't online outlets where you were greeted with some very strong opinions on the right way to do things inside a Kamado. For me, at that time, Kamado Joe wasn't a company, so it was a big green egg, but the opinions are almost identical to some of the things that I see in online echo chambers like Facebook groups today. And I've tested a couple of these rules. One, ribs. For example, 3-2-1 ribs. This is an amazing method if you have something like an offset smoker. I've never had ribs ready in under 4 hours on my offset, but I regularly have perfectly tender ribs in about 3 hours using my double indirect method on a Kamado Joe. This is a method that was developed for a completely different smoker with completely different heat retention characteristics. And so if I just took that rule and applied it to my Kamado, I'm running a temperature that's lower, produces worse smoke, and takes more time. So these barbecue rules just don't hold true. The second one that I tested is the water pan method. If you ask anybody in online groups, you don't need water pans in Kamados. And if you go back far enough into some of the Big Green Egg website archives, I'm sure you can find me parroting this same advice, even though I never tested it, to brand new users who had joined the forum and wanted to know, should they be adding a water pan? Because that's what works great in something like an offset or a Smoky Mountain, or even a Weber kettle. When I've done a couple of briskets and ribs like that, it benefits from a water pan. But having tested this side by side, there's actually a lot of improvement that comes with how the smoke adheres to our food by going with a water pan. And the only issue that this introduces is steaming the bottom of our food. And I've solved this by placing a deflector or a slow roller on top of that. And the slow roller works even better because we get that 20 times more circulation, is the claim from Kamado Joe, but now it's humid air. And the early part of our smoke absolutely benefits from this extra humidity and convection air from something like the slow roller in terms of the end result that we're able to produce. So we're 2 for 2 on dispelling some of these old urban legends that you hear in online forums or Facebook groups when it comes to getting the most out of your Kamado Joe. So today I'm going for the big one, which is the brisket fat cap up versus fat cap down. Let me explain some of the pros and cons of each method, and I'll fill you in on all the details for today's test. So just like the 3-2-1 rib method, the origins of this debate go back to translating something that was true for an offset smoker into a Kamado style grill. In most offsets, the type of offset that I have is a direct flow, or sometimes known as a Texas style offset, which is an open offset with the air rolling directly over the top of your food. It's not a reverse flow or anything else using baffle plates, deflectors to try and change the airflow characteristics. This is the type of pit used in almost every restaurant that's been featured in something like Texas Monthly. It's world renowned for its flavor and its signature rendering of the fat cap, and that's because the heat is rolling over the top of your brisket, and the consensus here is always brisket fat cap up. Well, maybe, I don't know where this started, but when it came to a Kamado and someone looked at it and said, hey, my heat's all coming from the bottom. If in an offset you want to protect from the flames and the heat rolling over top, we want to flip that brisket upside down and protect from the fire and the flames coming up from underneath our brisket. And this perhaps is how it got started. I don't know, I wasn't there for the first argument, but ever since then, that has really gained commonplace, is place your fat cap to wherever the heat signature is strongest. But having done this myself for nearly 20 years, you fall into a bit of an echo chamber and you compare your brisket result versus the best of the best. All of a sudden, you realize you're just missing something. And that's in part why I've picked up an offset for myself, so I can benchmark these things and find out what's just different versus what's actually better. But what I noticed when we do the fat cap down, when we slice our brisket, you just lose whatever remaining fat cap is there to the board, and we get a great bark on the top, but you miss that caramel candy texture that you get sort of properly yellow rendered fat that I get on my offset, or even we're able to reproduce on our Kamado Joe, and I'll show you how to do that exactly today. The fat cap up, though, introduces another problem, which is now we have no protection whatsoever on the bottom, and it is way too easy to burn the bottom of our brisket and get tearing when you go to slice into it. And so the way that I've solved this over recent years is using something like the foil boat method. The foil boat method helps protect the bottom and allows us to get that extra time needed. You absolutely need it in something like the Kamado Joe, where the entire cook, the top is exposed to that smoke, and just usually by the end of the cook, I've rendered that fat cap appropriately to the point where it can pass for offset quality in terms of a completely rendered fat cap. Not necessarily there yet on flavor, but is the closest thing that I've been able to produce. So that's what we're gonna do today. We're gonna cook a brisket fat cap down and compare it directly side by side to a fat cap up and see if there's any appreciable difference in terms of how these two different ethoses play out on our taste buds. Let me take you back to yesterday because I have one more secret in store. I was mentioning offset, nearly forgot my cue, which is smoked tallow. So we're gonna do a real wood fire inside of our Kamado Joe with the leftover hard fat trimmings and infuse that tallow with a little bit of extra wood smoke and inject it. So let me take you back to yesterday when I started the trimming, seasoning, the dry brine process overnight, as well as how to make this smoked tallow, which is absolutely game changer at upping the quality of the smoke taste in something like we're able to produce inside of our Kamado Joe. When you rejoin me current day, it'll be time to get into our cook and our taste test.
Okay, I found the two closest looking briskets that I could find in the pile at Costco, and that's where I'm looking for the thickness of the flat. Bad angle here, but if I can show you, I'm looking for the thin end to be close, the thicker part of the flat to be close, as well as on the top here that we don't have sort of a massive mohawk on one that I'm going to have to remove. Same thing with the decal. So these are two pretty close looking briskets. We're going to get these ready for our overnight dry brine. Now I've got an option for you here with tallow and injection. So first, easy option. Don't even bother. It's going to be awesome no matter what. But since these are choice grade briskets, I get a better result, more like prime, by injecting the briskets with their own tallow. So that's what I'm going to do. So if you want to improve the grade of your brisket, we're going to trim off some fat, render it down into tallow, and then inject this back into the brisket before we smoke it tomorrow. Speaking of smoke, I have another option here, which is we are going to smoke our tallow with wood. Again, this is 100% optional, but the results have been worth it. So we are going to fire up our Joe. If you want to follow along with this, I'm going to start by building a small little hot fire in the backside of my Kamado and placing a piece of smoking wood, as well as my next couple pieces of smoking wood at the front of the basket so they dehydrate. And this real wood fire inside of our Kamado Joe is going to smoke our tallow and render that down into some amazing smoked tallow that we are going to inject in this. And this has been a great way to start to close some of the taste gap that you get off of something like an offset smoker. Since tallow or other liquids take to smoke, they are very sensitive to what type of flavor profile we put on there. So by burning a real wood fire inside of our Kamado Joe, smoking our tallow, we can actually make up some ground on the overall brisket smoke quality. So that's exactly what I'm gonna do. But again, I recognize this is extra steps, and if you're stressing about that and worrying about a meat injector, my first experience with a meat injector, the meat exploded and I got raw pork all over me in injection. So completely no judgment if you don't want to follow along. But if you are looking to get a little bit more out of your brisket, smoked tallow inside of our Kamado Joe while we're going to get prepped for the overnight dry brine is absolutely awesome. So let me take you fast forward. We're going to get these out of the package, pat them dry, and we are going to prepare for our overnight dry brine. We're going to do one fat cap up and the other one fat cap down. So I'll take you fast forward while I start to get this ready. I've mentioned it before, but just in case you haven't seen it, a good trimming knife will make this much easier. I'm using a Dowel Strong. Let's get this out of the package. So I don't know if you can see that right here on the bottom, but we just have a massive chunk of hard fat. So I'm going to start with that because this is going to go into our smoked tallow pile. Show you here. Again, this is not meat, this is just hard fat. We'll do a bit more on that, but next I'm going to work on some of this silver skin and stringy fat. So it's easiest to run with the grain. Just get your knife right under there. And kind of like if you were removing the membrane on ribs, you just give that a little bit of tension and pull up. It'll help you stay closer to the surface so that we are just getting that stringy fat. So we're not taking any meat of any substance off that. That's maybe 1/8 of an inch. And that's not really going to render into anything, so that goes in the discard pile. Just trimming up some of the oxidized edges from the Costco packing facility, rounding out our corners. This, though, can go in our burger pile. Any meat is going to go in a burger pile. Okay, we got our first brisket trimmed up. Let's do the same thing. I'll take you fast forward, work on the second one, and we'll decide which one we'll do fat cap up, fat cap down. I've got another 1%, 2% just to finish on this, but I want to see which one has the ideal fat cap for up versus fat cap down. So I'll take you fast forward while I repeat the process on brisket number 2. Okay, we've got our 2 briskets trimmed up, our tallow ready to go on for the wood smoke. But first I want to get the dry brine rub on and get these back in the refrigerator. So I'm going to do this brisket as our fat cap up, this brisket as our fat cap down. So since this is going to be the downside, I'm going to start on the top and then we'll flip that one so we finish on the presentation side on each. Use some of the rub on the board to get any sides or edges. That way we have seasoning all the way around. Fat cap up into the refrigerator and fat cap down into the refrigerator. Let's get our tallow on. So you can see we're getting nice clean combustion out of our wood. I think it's time. I'm also going to add a couple more chunks just so that they are warming up so that they will combust. Don't know if at the angle you can see that, but I'm going to place these right down at the front where there is no fire. They're just going to get some of that heat from the fire, start to dry out. My accessory rack, just going to install one deflector right on the back. That way I still have access to the fire, can move logs freely. Cooking grid. I know I'm installing this wrong since I'm supposed to be against the notches, but I didn't see that till just now. Our beef fat, and let me get 2 cups of water. We're just going to pour that in, and by the time that distills down in about 2 hours, we're going to be getting great wood smoke for about 2 hours. The water is completely evaporated and that tallow is rendered out. Then we'll strain it and save it so that we can inject it back into our brisket before we put them on in the morning. Okay, add that water. The amount actually doesn't matter. It's just going to determine how long it takes to evaporate. So that looks good to me. Let's close this up. The amount of wood that I'm adding here, that's going to burn for about 45 minutes. So I'm only going to have to interact with the fire maybe twice by the time that our tallow is done. I'll see you in the morning when we are ready to inject that. Top vent and bottom vent will remain open the entire time. When we're using real wood, if we don't do that, you're going to get creosote. And since the point of this is getting good wood smoke on our tallow to inject it, we don't want to have any creosote. I'm just going to let it fly the entire time. So for our cook today, I'm going to be cooking on my Kamado Joe Big Joe Series 1 using my double indirect version 2.0 just to show you that it translates equally as well to the Series 1 as what I've shown on my Series 3. Now, if this all sounds too complicated, just skip it. Use your regular heat deflectors, slow roller, or whatever you're comfortable with. Some of this that I'm sharing is, again, purely in the pursuit of closing the gap to something like my offset smoker, and it's absolutely done that. But if you look at this and start saying deflectors, slow roller, this is all too much, you're going to get close to good enough of a result anyways, and you can always up the complexity if you want to. Again, if you've tasted an offset and said that is much better than what I'm cooking and I want to close that gap, then you can rejoin me at that moment in time and set up the exact same way. So if you want to do this even in something like the Series 1, the way that I do this is use my charcoal basket to hold up my heat deflector plate. So I'm going to place a piece of smoking wood or 2 at the bottom, cover that up with some fresh Fogo, use my grill blazer grill gun and start a nice hot fire in the center. And I want to hold this here for about a minute until the coals start to ash over nice and white. That's really important because I'm also going to place a piece of smoking wood directly on top of that charcoal pile so that it will combust right away. When we cover this now with our deflector plates as well as a water pan, so I'm just using a foil pan, but if you have a small little round aluminum dish, you can use that as well, and put our slow roller on top. This has been a game changer at helping infuse smoke particles with the right level of humidity to adhere to our meat. So by placing a water pan under the slow roller, we get the benefit of the slow roller circulating the air 20 times more, and that is absolutely worth doing if you haven't tried it. After that, in my Series 1, I don't have as much space in my Series 3, so I can't get away by installing something like my smokeware drip pan, but I'm just going to put a little bit of aluminum foil to reduce the amount of cleanup that I have to do on top of my slow roller later. Or if you had a really thin profile pan, this would absolutely work as well. Then we're going to place our 2 briskets on there, install a meter probe, and every couple hours or so, not only will I continue to spray,
but I'm going to add some smoking wood. Speaking of smoking wood, I'm going to use some wood to help prop up the two briskets, particularly early on, as that fat rendering tends to pool on top and potentially ruin our bark. So to get a little bit of a tallow waterfall off the side of our brisket, I've used 2 little wood chunks to hold the briskets up. The advantage of doing this is these wood splits dry out. They also soak in and absorb a bunch of fat. I think Mad Scientist and Chuds have also shared throwing some fat into the fire. Well, if you let your wood get infused with some of that fat and rendering, I've noticed you get the same benefit, not only of the wood flavor, but also some of that burning fat without making a huge mess in the bottom of our Kamado Joe. And so what I'm gonna do is use them as props at first, and then later I'll just get out my hatchet, break them down into smaller pieces, and slide that into our ash drawer so we can continue rolling some nice clean smoke. Because the easiest way to supplement our smoke throughout the entire cook is using something like the ash drawer. If you are having trouble getting this to burn, try something smaller. Wood chips, pellets will absolutely burn. Typically, if you're not getting good combustion on the bottom of your wood, it's maybe you have too much charcoal, the fire is too high, or if you're going with single deflector plates or a slow roller, the advantage of the double indirect fire is it burns more fuel, and because it's burning more fuel, it's dropping more embers. We're intentionally driving with the gas and the brake pedal pressed at the same time to increase our fuel consumption, because in barbecue, more fuel consumption and a cleaner burning fire absolutely tastes better. After that, the plan is to move to a foil boat on my fat cap up, which is like how I would always prepare the brisket, versus the benefit of fat cap down is the fat cap here is going to provide the protection that we need. So I'm not going to do anything different to the fat cap down, as I want to compare in its argument state how well the fat cap performs at protecting the bottom, as well as the foil boat does at protecting the fat cap up brisket. I'll rejoin you a little bit later on with an update and our taste test.
Okay, let's check on our second brisket. It was just a little bit tight about 15-20 minutes ago. See how we're doing now. Still a little tight. Getting there on temperature, but this is not the room temperature butter feel that I want. You can see there's still a bit of, it's like it's grabbing onto the end of the probe. You can see it lifting. So even though we are at a temperature that is nearly perfect, this is not right yet. So I'm going to give it a little bit more time. Okay, so these have rested out now down to about 140 degrees Fahrenheit internal temperature. I can get rid of the meters that we're keeping track of that, so won't be needing those anymore. The advantage though of the foil boat brisket with the fat cap up is I had some extra tallow, so I was able to just pour a little bit of that reserve tallow on top of each. The fat cap down was looking and feeling a little bit dry on the top, even though this bark looks fantastic. It's definitely, you know, in terms of a definition of bark, it looks great. Whether or not that tears or is dried out, we will see. Whereas when we have our fat cap up, even though I did try and manage the pooling, and some of this is from me adding a little bit of that saved tallow, the bark is not quite as good. So let's get into slicing these and see how they cut, and more importantly, how they taste. Slide out of the way, make a little bit of space here on my cutting board. So I'm going to start with the fat cap down. Oh, look at that. This is going to be good. So no issue going through the top. A little bit of resistance on the bottom, but we've got good rendered fat here. That's what you want to see. I don't want to squeeze that out, but that dark color, we don't want to have large white globs, even though it could get a little bit more down here. This looks pretty good. Let's check our point. Feels incredible. And again, juices galore. Help stop that from oxidizing since we've got plenty of spare tallow. Let's take a look. Same spot in our fat cap up brisket. Nice clean cut. Interestingly, a larger looking smoke ring. Pretty comparable, but slightly larger even with the fat cap up. That we've got a great looking smoke ring. Let's check our point end. And again, really nice rendered fat there. Could get a touch more here. All in all, that looks pretty good. The advantage of something like the long hot hold, which I didn't do today, helps just make sure that we get this last little bit of render, because there's time and temperature. Those are the two things that are going to help render that out. And here we definitely have the temperature, but maybe a touch more time and a long hot hold would have made this absolutely perfect. But hey, looking at that, I don't think anyone is going to be complaining. Let's get a couple slices. So this is off of our fat cap up. It's holding together under its own weight. I'm about a pencil in width. Ooh, hot still. Get the little flyaway little birdie flap. The other thing that we're looking for here is this brown sort of caramelized rendered fat right on the top that's just squishy when I press that. That looks really good. Let's get a slice out of our fat cap down. So again, holding up. Nice and floppy on the bend test, and just the slightest pull, and this is all coming apart. Can't wait to dive in for our taste test. Best part of the day. Let's dig in. I'm going to start with our fat cap down. Got a piece here. It's a good brisket. That's smoked tallow. If you haven't tried that, this is 100% worth doing. We take nothing away, and we still are unsettled about fat cap up or fat cap down. There's no debate about that smoked tallow helping bring this even closer to an offset. I've done it a couple times in the background. This is my first time sharing on a video, but it's remarkable. I'm going to do one more piece here. I got so excited about the tallow and the smoke flavor that I forgot to tell you about the bark. It's exactly like what it looks like. It's kind of like a sandwich where we've got two pieces of bread. It's a little bit dry on the outside, and then in this case, it's a brisket sandwich, incredibly juicy and moist on the inside. We're getting sort of the layers of juiciness, starting with very dry on the outside and on the bottom. And I'm not really retaining anything on that bottom slice that's giving me sort of that same sort of fat cap, but I'm getting bark, top and bottom. Do one more piece here. Make sure I'm not misleading you. But just a touch dry, like you're seeing. Even when I was cutting some of these stringy strands where the bark was just a little bit too dry for my liking, and this is starting to be right on the cusp of tearing. Let's try our fat cap up. Again, the benefit of this is we're getting that sort of squishy rendered fat on top. Let's try. Only be fair to do two since I did two of the other one at least, right? Fair is fair. So as you'd expect, since both of these were cooked in the same Kamado using the same technique, they taste very, very similar. So some of the differences that we're able to pick up, it's exactly like I mentioned before with the sandwich analogy. So our fat cap down, we've got that sort of dry texture on the outside, dry on the bottom, and then nice and juicy in the middle. With our fat cap up, we're getting that extra little something. Honestly, this is what you're missing. If you go to a Texas barbecue joint, you've only ever cooked fat cap down, and you get fat cap up for the first time, you're gonna say, wow, why doesn't my brisket taste like that? That's exactly what we're getting here. Interestingly enough, even though the smoke ring is more pronounced on the brisket with the fat cap up, I think it's actually a couple percentage points milder in terms of the smoke profile. It's a little bit hard because of the texture is really different. We're getting dry, and some of that dryness in the bark where the spices maybe sort of caramelize and crisp up could be some of that difference. If anything, borderline, almost a little bit of a burnt taste on our fat cap up, whereas I'm not getting anything that tastes burnt or off-putting. It's just nice, clean smoke, great bite through, and great taste all the way through. So now, having done these two side by side, I did them many, many times independently on their own and found this experience to be true, but I'm absolutely going to confirm it doing it side by side today, that for me, fat cap up makes a better overall quality brisket, even on a grill like the Kamado Joe, where you've got our heat source coming up from the bottom versus flowing over the top. I hope you really enjoyed this test, and I'll see you in the next one. I'm James from Smoke It At Barbecue signing off. Don't be afraid to fire it up.